It was supposed to be just another peaceful evening in her new home. Naomi Redford, a retired Army veteran, had moved to a quiet neighborhood in Temecula hoping for serenity after years of service in some of the world's most dangerous zones. She wasn't expecting drama, just sunsets, walks with her dog, and a front porch where she could breathe. But peace shattered the moment she heard the deliberate knock. Not frantic, not casual, intentional, like someone trying to assert dominance before saying a word. When she opened the door, 3 men in tactical vests stood on her porch, claiming to be from the Homeowners Compliance Task Force. Their tone was officious, their vests militarized, and their laminated badges looked like they were printed at a library. Their issue? Her American flag was apparently hung at the wrong angle. Naomi, who had served 16 years and earned 2 Bronze Stars, knew how to respect a flag. But this wasn't about patriotism. It was about control. One of the men subtly displayed a taser. Another asked her to come with them. That's when Naomi's demeanor shifted. Calm, unwavering, and deadly precise. She had faced down insurgents. She wasn't going to blink at 3 imposters on her doorstep. What they didn't realize was that Naomi wasn't alone. She never had been. And what came next would remind them that some women fight wars quietly, but they never forget how to fight. When Naomi Redford opened her front door to 3 strangers dressed like budget security extras from a low-budget action movie, she didn't expect the evening to spiral into something out of a psychological standoff. The men claimed they were with the Homeowners Compliance Task Force of her Temecula neighborhood. Spouting off a supposed violation, her American flag was hung at an incorrect angle. They cited Code 14B, a rule Naomi, a veteran of 16 years with 2 Bronze Stars and a lifetime of military precision, had never heard of. The man in front, with a goatee and mirrored sunglasses, tried to act authoritative as he flashed a flimsy laminated card without any official insignia. Behind him, one man chewed gum like it was a threat, and the third, broad-shouldered with visible tattoos creeping up his neck, subtly unhooked a taser from his belt and let it hang at his side. Clearly visible, Naomi, unbothered and unshaken, calmly pointed out the obvious. Their credentials were fake, their authority fabricated, and what they were doing, armed and on her property, was bordering on criminal impersonation. But the men doubled down. They insisted she accompany them to their HOA office, which she knew for a fact was a glorified storage shed. Their aggression wasn't about codes, it was about intimidation. These weren't enforcers of neighborhood peace. They were bullies in costume, performing a fantasy of control. What they didn't count on was Naomi's refusal to be intimidated. With Ranger, her German shepherd, quietly alert behind her, Naomi stepped fully outside and stood her ground. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her presence was sharper than any weapon. And as she calmly dismantled their false claims, piece by piece, she made it clear. This was her home, not their playground for power. But just as things teetered toward escalation, footsteps sounded from nearby driveways. One by one, figures emerged from shadows, quiet, steady, calm. 3, then 4, then 5 women surrounded Naomi's lawn like a silent perimeter. No uniforms, no weapons, just an unmistakable air of capability and presence. These were her former Special Forces teammates, the women she'd led into combat zones overseas. They weren't there by accident. Naomi had invited them to visit for a reunion, unaware it would become something else entirely. The so-called task force realized too late that they hadn't cornered a woman alone on her porch. They'd provoked a protector surrounded by warriors. The dynamic shifted instantly. What was once an attempted act of forced compliance turned into a scene of quiet reckoning. The goatee man's voice faltered. The gum chewer looked pale, and Tattoo Neck backed away. Naomi didn't need backup, but she had it. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. When you attempt to weaponize fear, make sure you're not standing in front of someone who has already survived real war. The men, still clinging to the illusion of authority, didn't realize how far out of their depth they were. But the neighborhood was beginning to notice. Doors opened, phones came out, witnesses gathered. Naomi, calm as ever, gave them one last chance to leave before real law enforcement arrived. And when the police did come, sirens flashing, badges real, those men who tried to dictate compliance found themselves in cuffs. Because the moment they stepped on Naomi's porch with fake power and real weapons, they crossed a line. They hadn't just tried to enforce a made-up rule. They'd committed a crime. And in the end, Naomi didn't have to raise her voice, because truth, when delivered without fear, is the loudest sound of all. When Naomi Redford stood silently on her front porch, confronting 3 armed men masquerading as enforcers of fake neighborhood codes, she didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch, and didn't blink. That composure didn't come from luck, it was earned. What those men didn't know, and what many of her neighbors had never guessed, was that Naomi had once led an elite special forces unit into hostile territory, flying over Kandahar under the cover of night with no backup, no guarantees, and no margin for error. She had survived ambushes, patched herself up in deserts miles from safety, and guided her team through impossible odds. When she left the military, she did so with 2 bronze stars, a reconstructed shoulder, and a quiet vow to build a life that felt like peace. So when 3 grown men in cargo boots and knockoff tactical vests showed up at her door trying to scare her over the angle of her American flag, Naomi didn't see a threat. She saw amateurs playing dress-up with borrowed bravado. To them, she was just another woman on the block, quiet, alone, not likely to push back. That was their second mistake. Their first was thinking a laminated card and a taser made them powerful. But Naomi had seen real authority. She knew what it meant to have command. And she recognized instantly that these men were grasping at control they hadn't earned. When they escalated, showing a weapon, demanding she come with them, Naomi's instincts kicked in. The same way they had 100 times before in war zones far more dangerous than her suburban lawn. She didn't panic, she analyzed. She didn't react, she prepared. And that's when the men realized they'd miscalculated. Because Naomi didn't just have experience, she had backup. Without a word, her old team began appearing. One from the side yard, another from the neighbor's driveway, a third from behind a parked SUV. They weren't in formation, and they weren't armed, but the moment they arrived, the energy shifted. The men, who had strutted onto Naomi's property with a forced swagger, suddenly looked like boys in a costume contest that had gone horribly wrong. Naomi didn't need to say who these women were. Their presence spoke louder than introductions ever could. The way they moved, the way they held themselves, it was unmistakable. You didn't need to be told they were trained, you could feel it. The silence was thick, electric. One of the men, trying to salvage control, repeated the accusation. Your flag is crooked. There are standards. Naomi finally stepped forward, meeting his eyes. You're making up codes, she said, her voice low and steady. You're not law enforcement. You have no authority. You're standing on my porch with a weapon. And that makes you the threat. It was more than a correction. It was a line in the sand. What those 3 didn't realize until it was too late was that strength doesn't come from uniforms or from shouting orders. It comes from the way someone stands when the odds are against them. It comes from the people who step forward when others retreat. Naomi wasn't alone, and she never had been. Her team knew exactly when to show up. They always had, because the bond forged in combat doesn't fade with distance. It just waits for the next call. And that day, when men with fake power came knocking, Naomi didn't just defend herself. She reminded everyone watching what real strength looks like. Not the kind that intimidates, but the kind that protects. The arrival of the sheriff's deputies marked a definitive shift in what had started as an unsettling power play. Naomi Redford, calm and precise, met them at the edge of her driveway and handed over her phone, the entire confrontation recorded. From the moment the so-called compliance task force knocked on her door to the moment one of them revealed a taser in plain sight. Deputy Flores, all no nonsense and authority, took one look at the video and knew immediately this wasn't just a neighborly disagreement. Naomi didn't need to explain much. Her tone, her posture, and the presence of her old Special Forces unit standing nearby said it all. She wasn't rattled, she was documenting, and what she documented was a group of men impersonating law enforcement, threatening a private citizen on her own property, and attempting to use a weapon to enforce fictional neighborhood codes. Rick Dalton, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, tried to recover his swagger. "We're neighborhood security," he insisted to the deputies, authorized by the HOA, but his claim unraveled quickly. Their badges? Fake. Their authority? Non-existent. Their gear? Self-funded cosplay. Flores's partner confirmed as much after running their IDs and inspecting the laminated cards that bore no official seals or legal backing. "These aren't credentials," he said bluntly. "This is a costume party with weapons." As Rick and his crew fumbled for excuses, the truth began to cut through the facade. The second deputy pointed to the taser strapped to Rick's thigh. "That changes everything," he said. Now they weren't just impersonators, they were armed impersonators. A serious charge, one that crossed the line from HOA nuisance into criminal territory. When Rick tried to protest, claiming they were just trying to keep order, Naomi spoke clearly and without anger. "What you tried to do was intimidate me. What you did was attempt to detain me, without cause, without authority, and with a weapon." And just like that, the dynamic reversed completely. Deputies secured the men in handcuffs and escorted them to cruisers waiting 2 blocks away, cutting off their ridiculous golf cart patrol mid-route. Neighbors, who had watched quietly from windows and porches, began to emerge. Some looked embarrassed, others relieved. One woman offered Naomi lemonade. Another apologized for not speaking up sooner. A black couple from down the street brought a folding tray with snacks and whispered, "We've had problems with them too," but didn't want to be the first to say it. The silence had broken. But what made this moment even more powerful wasn't just that justice was finally in motion. It was how it began. Naomi didn't shout, didn't escalate. She stood with truth, discipline, and a video that spoke louder than any accusation. Her military training didn't just keep her composed, it allowed her to treat the incident not as a personal affront, but as a tactical failure on their part. She knew exactly what she needed to do: document, wait, act. Deputy Flores confirmed they'd be filing charges: impersonation of law enforcement, unlawful detention, and a weapons violation. And when Naomi offered to provide statements from her team, each of them retired Special Forces veterans, the deputies didn't just accept. They paused, slightly awestruck. "He picked the wrong house," Flores muttered, and Naomi gave a small, quiet nod. It was a victory, yes, but not just over Rick Dalton. It was a victory over the idea that silence is the safest option. Naomi hadn't planned for confrontation, but when trouble came to her doorstep, she stood tall. Not to prove a point, but to make sure no one else on her block would have to face that kind of fear again. As word spread through the neighborhood, what had begun as a targeted act of intimidation against Naomi Redford unraveled into a much larger, more troubling picture. Residents who had remained quiet for months, some out of fear, some out of uncertainty, began to speak. First came the whispered thank yous from neighbors she barely knew. Then came the emails, dozens of them, some short, others pages long, but all echoing the same truth: they had experienced the same harassment. The so-called Compliance Task Force, led by Rick Dalton and his 2 friends, had been patrolling the neighborhood for months, issuing fake citations, making veiled threats, and following residents, almost all of whom were Black, Latino, or Asian. Naomi wasn't the first. She was simply the first to record it, confront it, and have the support to stand against it. The stories were chilling in their consistency. One woman said Rick accused her teenage son of loitering in front of their own garage. Another neighbor described how Rick tried to force his way into her home, claiming he needed to inspect her sprinkler system. Several described being filmed from a golf cart, with no warning or consent. It was systemic, intentional, and always framed as protecting the neighborhood. But what protection looks like depends on who gets to define it. And in this case, the definition had clearly been twisted into a weapon of control. Naomi's teammates, former Special Forces operators who knew how to sift through chaos and find clarity, immediately got to work. Leah compiled the testimonies into a spreadsheet, mapping out dates, targets, and types of incidents. Drea, always tactical, dug through public HOA meeting notes and found what they feared 4 months earlier. A vague line item approving volunteer community oversight and a small budget for reflective gear, badge printing, and patrol maintenance. The board had quietly signed off on giving Rick and his crew the illusion of legitimacy. Worse, they did so without a public vote, without background checks, and without oversight. Naomi realized this wasn't just about a few aggressive men with delusions of power. It was about a system that allowed it to happen. A system that turned a blind eye when certain neighbors were harassed. A system that gave vague authority to people who had no training, no accountability, and dangerous ideas about order and race. The same board that handed out Good Neighbor awards at potlucks had, whether knowingly or through willful ignorance, fueled a pattern of intimidation under the guise of compliance. So Naomi did what she'd been trained to do. She planned. She coordinated. She gathered evidence. And she took it to the HOA board, not as a victim, but as a witness armed with facts. She demanded transparency, accountability, and most of all, change. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Her presence carried the weight of truth. And when she presented the names, dates, videos, and testimonies, the room couldn't ignore her anymore. What made Naomi's stand so powerful wasn't just that she exposed 3 bullies. It was that she held up a mirror to the community and asked them to look closely. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a culture, subtle, polite on the surface, but built on silence and fear. And now, that silence was cracking. One email, one story, one neighbor at a time. Naomi had become the catalyst, not because she shouted the loudest, but because she refused to stay quiet when it mattered most. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood began to listen. When Naomi Redford stood before the HOA board that evening, the room was uncomfortably quiet. The community center's usual hum of side chatter and neighborly small talk had vanished. In its place was a palpable tension, the kind that fills the air when truth is about to dismantle something built on pretense. Naomi, composed and deliberate, began to speak, not with outrage, but with facts. She laid out the timeline. Rick Dalton's self-appointed compliance task force. The fake citations, the weapons, the targeted residents, and the disturbing pattern of who had been harassed. She presented testimonies from over 20 neighbors, every one of them a person of color, all sharing eerily similar encounters with Rick and his crew. It was a pattern too glaring to ignore. Beside her sat Leah and Drea, former Special Forces teammates and now trusted investigators in this suburban battlefield. They provided visual aids, maps, incident logs, even screenshots from Rick's public Facebook posts bragging about taking the neighborhood back and reminding people of the rules. But it wasn't just the evidence that made the board shift in their seats, it was the truth behind it. Naomi revealed that Rick's supposed authority stemmed from a buried HOA clause allowing volunteer oversight. A clause that had been quietly passed without community input. The budget line for neighborhood safety uniforms had funded their vests, their fake badges, and even the golf cart they used to patrol and intimidate. The board members, once aloof, were now visibly uncomfortable. 2 of them, Mr. Halpern and Ms. Whitaker, tried to deflect, calling it a misunderstanding, claiming they never imagined it would be used this way. But Naomi wasn't there for excuses. She asked a simple question. Would you have felt safe if these men came to your home? Demanded you step outside, and showed you a weapon? The room was silent. Then came the breaking point. A young couple stood up from the back. They'd only recently moved into the neighborhood. Rick told us not to hang laundry on our balcony, the wife said, her voice trembling. But we never got a letter. Just a knock. He said, certain people made the place look unkempt. The certain people in question were immigrants from India. That was the final thread. The room shifted from discomfort to clarity. This wasn't about rule enforcement. It was about targeting. The board had no choice. Under pressure from Naomi and an increasingly vocal group of residents, they voted, right then and there, to suspend all volunteer enforcement. The compliance task force was disbanded, their equipment collected, and their budget frozen. Mr. Halpern and Ms. Whitaker, facing calls for accountability, resigned within the week. Naomi's demand for transparency became policy. From that point on, HOA decisions were subject to full public review. Votes required quorum, and no rule could be passed without notifying every household. The community had been asleep, but Naomi had woken it up. But this wasn't just about procedural reform. Naomi's actions had exposed something deeper. Her calm, relentless pursuit of truth reminded the neighborhood that safety doesn't come from silence. It comes from watchfulness paired with courage. That night at the meeting, Naomi didn't just reclaim her dignity or demand justice for herself. She offered a path forward for a community that had lost its way. And perhaps most powerfully of all, she proved that leadership isn't about titles or power. It's about showing up when it matters, and being brave enough to call a wrong by its name. In the days that followed the HOA meeting, a quiet transformation began sweeping through Naomi Redford's neighborhood, subtle at first, then steadily more visible. It wasn't the kind of change that comes with speeches or banners, but the kind that settles into everyday moments, hesitant smiles becoming warm waves. Porch lights turned on not just for safety, but as invitations. For months, the neighborhood had lived under a spell of silence, neighbors wary of one another, afraid of being the next target of Rick Dalton's self-declared compliance task force. People had learned to shrink into their routines, to avoid confrontation, to pretend the patrolling golf cart was normal. But now, that spell was broken, and Naomi was at the heart of it. It started with simple gestures. An elderly Latino couple who had once covered their windows to avoid being watched now spent evenings on their front lawn, waving to kids riding bikes. A black single mother, who'd previously been harassed for having a cluttered carport, spoke up at a neighborhood watch meeting for the first time, and was applauded. Even the family from India, who Rick had told not to hang laundry outside, began attending HOA gatherings, no longer afraid they didn't belong. The fear was still there, like smoke after a fire, but it no longer ruled the street. Naomi hadn't just stopped Rick, she had given people permission to be seen again. The effect rippled outward. Conversations that had once been limited to parking violations or lawn height became deeper. People asked questions like, why didn't we speak up sooner? Who else was affected? And perhaps most tellingly, what else have we been too afraid to face? The veneer of politeness had been shattered, replaced with something far more honest, a willingness to acknowledge the uncomfortable and to hold each other accountable. Naomi never claimed credit. In fact, she often waved off the praise, redirecting it to her former teammates or the brave neighbors who had come forward with their stories. But the truth was undeniable. She had become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of resilience. The woman who had once blended into the block had become the one others looked to when they needed strength. And while she never raised her voice, her presence reminded everyone that courage doesn't always announce itself. It often just stands quietly and refuses to move. Media coverage followed, not because Naomi sought it, but because the story was too powerful to ignore. Veteran confronts fake security in HOA scandal. Read one headline. Another. California woman sparks neighborhood reckoning. Journalists wanted interviews. Advocacy groups reached out. But Naomi remained focused on the local impact. If what happened here helps one other neighborhood prevent this, she told a reporter, then I've done my job. And she had, because what Naomi gave her community wasn't just safety, it was agency. She showed them how to ask questions, how to push back, how to believe their own experiences. And perhaps most importantly, she reminded them of the most essential truth in any neighborhood, any city, any nation. People are stronger when they stand together. That strength doesn't come from force, it comes from connection, from listening, from believing someone when they say, something's not right, and from having the courage to say, I believe you, let's do something about it. In the end, Naomi didn't just change the rules, she changed the culture, and long after the vests and badges were gone, her impact remained, in every unlocked door, in every shared meal, and in every neighbor who no longer felt alone. As Naomi Redford's story began to reach beyond her neighborhood, its resonance took on a life of its own. News outlets, podcasts, and community blogs across the country picked it up, not because it was sensational, but because it struck a chord. There was something deeply familiar about it. A woman, underestimated and targeted, choosing not to react with rage or violence but with clarity, discipline, and quiet strength. People saw in Naomi the kind of courage they hoped they would have if faced with injustice. And more importantly, they saw how ordinary systems, HOAs, neighborhood watch programs, local boards, could go unchecked and cause harm when no one dared to ask hard questions. Her story wasn't just about one neighborhood in Temecula. It was about every place where silence has allowed the wrong people to hold power. Across the country, emails and letters began arriving at Naomi's home, many from women, veterans, immigrants, and people of color. They wrote about their own experiences with fake authority and community control. A woman in Texas who was fined repeatedly by her HOA for planting vegetables in her front yard. A black family in Georgia who received anonymous notes every time their relatives visited. A trans veteran in Ohio harassed for flying the pride flag outside their apartment. All different stories, but all echoing the same theme. Some people use systems to exclude others, and it's time we started challenging that. Naomi read every single message. Sometimes they made her angry. Sometimes they made her cry. But mostly, they reminded her why she had stepped forward in the first place, not to fight, but to make space for others to feel safe enough to live fully and openly. It wasn't long before she was asked to speak, first at a local civic forum, then at a veteran-led town hall, and eventually at a national conference on neighborhood equity and safety. Naomi, who once avoided the spotlight, now stood at podiums with purpose. I didn't plan to be a symbol, she said in one speech. I plan to enjoy my retirement, walk my dog, and finally learn how to bake bread. But when someone shows up at your door with a weapon and a lie, you have two choices. You can shut the door, or you can stand in it. I chose to stand. The crowd stood with her, not because of theatrics, but because they knew she wasn't just speaking about Rick Dalton and his fake badges. She was speaking about every moment we've been told to keep our heads down and just let it go. In time, Naomi helped form a task force of her own, not for compliance, but for accountability. With the help of her Special Forces sisters, legal advisors, and civic advocates, she launched a grassroots program that helped neighborhoods audit their HOA policies, educate residents about their rights, and train them in bystander intervention. The program spread quickly, mostly through word of mouth and social media. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't political, it was just practical, grounded, and needed. It made people feel less alone. And that was Naomi's biggest mission, to make sure that no one, in any zip code, would be made to feel like an outsider in the place they call home. Her neighborhood, once known for its rigid order and unspoken divides, had become a place of conversations, cookouts, and real community. Naomi often said she didn't want to be anyone's hero, but to the people who wrote her, walked beside her, or changed because of her, she already was. In the months following the confrontation, Naomi Redford's quiet street in Temecula had transformed from a place of silent compliance into a vibrant symbol of civic courage, and the shift began with the children. Once wary of being watched or corrected, kids now rode their bikes freely again, their laughter echoing through the cul-de-sacs that had once felt stifling. Parents who had hesitated to speak up before now chatted openly at mailbox clusters and leaned over fences to exchange stories. But perhaps the most remarkable change was the way the next generation began to understand the meaning of responsibility, not as a tool of control, but as an act of collective care. Teachers at the local elementary school reported that students were suddenly more engaged in classroom discussions about fairness, rules, and standing up for others. And it wasn't hard to trace it back to one woman's courage. Naomi never intended to become a lesson plan. But when one fifth-grade teacher asked her to speak during a Community Heroes Week, she agreed, reluctantly at first. She didn't consider herself a hero. "I just did what I was trained to do," she told the class. "Assess the situation, protect others, stay calm, tell the truth." The students, wide-eyed and full of questions, didn't need medals or flashy titles to recognize the strength in her words. They asked if she was scared. Naomi nodded. "Of course I was. But bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about what you do even though you are." A boy in the back raised his hand. "Would you do it again?" Naomi didn't hesitate. "Yes, because no one should be made to feel unsafe in their own home. And sometimes, if you're the only one who sees what's wrong, you have to be the first one to stand up." Word spread. Her talk was shared among schools in the district. A social studies curriculum unit began using a simplified version of Naomi's story to teach about local governance, accountability, and ethics. Kids drew pictures of her standing in front of a house with a flag, surrounded by smiling neighbors and speech bubbles that said things like, "Be brave," and "We got your back." For Naomi, it was surreal, but deeply affirming. What had started as a terrifying knock on her door had turned into a ripple effect that reached far beyond property lines or policy documents. And it wasn't just children who learned from her example. Local police departments and HOA associations reached out, requesting to use her video footage as a training tool for identifying and preventing abuse of perceived authority. "You showed people what it looks like when someone calmly asserts their rights without escalating the situation," one officer told her. "That's rare and powerful." Naomi began consulting quietly on community equity initiatives, helping neighborhoods ensure their systems were transparent, fair, and inclusive. It was never about becoming famous. It was about making sure no one else had to fight the same fight alone. In the end, Naomi didn't just change the culture of her community, she educated it. Her actions became a living curriculum in courage, compassion, and accountability. And while she continued to walk her dog at sunrise and plant tomatoes in her backyard like any other retiree, she did so knowing that her quiet stand had taught both children and adults the most important lesson of all. Real leadership doesn't come from authority, it comes from integrity. And when integrity meets action, even a single voice can echo through generations. Sometimes, the smallest decisions lead to the most profound ripple effects. When Naomi Redford answered the knock at her door, she didn't know that what waited on the other side would test not just her sense of safety, but her commitment to justice. 3 men, armed not just with fake badges and a taser, but with a warped sense of power, tried to intimidate her under the guise of neighborhood enforcement. They didn't know Naomi. They didn't know her past in the military, her years of learning to stay calm under pressure, her instinct to document, observe, and protect. They saw a quiet woman on a quiet street. What they didn't see was the fire beneath her silence, the unwavering line she refused to let them cross. In standing her ground, Naomi didn't just protect herself. She exposed a rot hidden beneath a clean suburban facade. She showed her neighbors that what had happened to her had happened to many, but until then, no one had spoken up. Through her steady strength, she gave others the courage to say, "Me too," and "Enough." Her act, recording, reporting, confronting, set off a chain reaction. The fake enforcers were arrested. The HOA's blind spots were held accountable. Rules were rewritten. But more than that, people's hearts were rewired. A community that once lived in quiet fear began to talk, to gather, to listen. Naomi didn't just restore order, she restored trust. And that's the lesson. Real change doesn't always begin with protests or politics. Sometimes it begins with one person who chooses not to back down. One person who says, "This isn't right," and refuses to be silenced. Naomi didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted peace. But when peace required confrontation, she met it, not with anger, but with integrity. And in doing so, she reminded us all. The strongest people are not the loudest. They're the ones who act with purpose when no one's watching. To everyone watching this, ask yourself, what would you do if someone crossed a line? Would you stay silent to keep the peace? Or would you risk being uncomfortable to protect what's right? If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone brave in your life, or someone who shouldn't have had to be, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your story, your voice, and if you believe more people need to hear stories like Naomi's, of courage, of quiet strength, of one person making a difference, please hit like and subscribe. Because together, one story at a time, we can build a world where no one has to stand alone.